In the vast, unforgiving heart of the Montana Badlands, a man of immense wealth was about to commit an act of profound cruelty. He would abandon 4 sick children to the searing sun, walking away with a chilling indifference that defied humanity. The children, frail and now utterly forsaken, stood no chance of survival. But miles away, a lone grey stallion, watching the horizon as if he could see the future, was about to do the impossible. First, if you, like us, believe in the incredible spirit of animals, please subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss a single moving story. Thank you. Now, let's return to our story. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when the soft thud of hooves echoed in the courtyard of the most imposing estate in the territory. A stooped figure dismounted with difficulty, her movements heavy with age and the weight of an unbearable sorrow. The old woman held on to the wrought iron gate, her trembling hands leaving a trail of cold sweat on the metal, still frigid from the pre-dawn air. Far across the Badlands, distant from that scene of desperation, a grey stallion lifted his head, a sudden, sharp movement. His nostrils flared, catching a scent on the wine that did not belong. It wasn't the familiar smell of dry sagebrush or dusty earth. It was something else, something that made his powerful heart quicken with an unease he couldn't explain. The horse shook his magnificent mane, his intelligent eyes fixed on the distant town, as if he could peer through miles of sand and rock. Meanwhile, back at the estate, a bell chimed 3 times before heavy footsteps approached the grand front door. The man who opened it was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, even at this early hour. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his cold eyes assessed the visitor with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. Alistair Finch, as he insisted on being called, was not accustomed to being disturbed by common folk, and certainly not at his private residence. The woman before him was the antithesis of everything he represented. Her white hair was a disheveled halo, and her simple clothes bore the marks of a long, desperate journey. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. There was a pain in them so deep that even his hardened heart faltered for a fraction of a second. "Please, Mr. Finch," her voice was a broken whisper. "I beg you to listen. I know it's early. I know I have no right to be here, but I have no one else to turn to." Alistair's brow furrowed, his patience already wearing thin. "Madam, if you are looking for money, you can speak to my foreman in the town. He handles such matters." "It's not money," she interrupted, tears finally spilling from her eyes. "It's my nieces and nephews. 4 little ones, sir. They are very sick, and I have no way to pay for the treatment they need." The wealthy man crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "And what does that have to do with me?" The question was so cold, so sharp, that the old woman staggered as if struck. She gripped the doorframe, gathering her strength to continue. Because they are your responsibility too, Mr. Finch. My brother, their father, worked on your land for 15 years. He died last year in an accident at your factory, and their mother, she couldn't bear the grief. I am all they have now." Alistair Finch remained silent, processing her words. He vaguely recalled the man, a diligent worker who never caused problems, but that didn't mean he had any obligation to the family left behind. Far away, the grey stallion had begun to pace in restless circles. His owner, a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled into a practical knot, watched the animal's strange behavior. Isabel Croft had learned to trust her horse's instincts over the long, lonely years in the wilderness. If something was troubling Whisper this much, there was a reason. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, approaching the stallion and stroking his neck. "What do you sense out there?" At the manor, the tense silence stretched on. The desperate aunt, introducing herself as Eleanor Vance, continued her plea, describing the children's condition, their persistent fevers, the coughs that never ceased. She spoke of how she'd sold everything she owned to try and afford basic medicine, of the long nights spent watching over the little ones as they cried for their lost parents. Alistair listened, but his mind was already calculating. Accepting responsibility for 4 sick children would be an enormous burden, both financially and socially. On the other hand, a public refusal could tarnish his carefully crafted reputation in the community. He needed a solution that served his own interests. A cold, thin smile began to form on his lips. "Come in, madam," he said finally, opening the door wider. "Let's talk about your children." The interior of Finchworth Manor was as intimidating as its exterior. Rich carpets covered polished marble floors, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from walls panelled in dark, expensive wood. Eleanor followed Alistair through the main hall, her hesitant footsteps echoing in the elegant, empty house. Alistair led her to his private library, a room he used to impress visitors and sign important deals. Towering shelves reached the ceiling, filled with books he had never read but which lent an aura of wisdom and respectability. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, gesturing for Eleanor to take an uncomfortable chair on the other side. "Now, Mrs. Vance," he began, steepling his fingers. "I need you to tell me the exact situation with these children." Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "There are 4, sir. Clara is 8, the oldest. Then there's Leo, who is 7. After that comes Rosie, who is 6, and little Sam, who just turned 5. Her voice trembled as she mentioned each name. "They all have a fever that won't break, Mr. Finch. They cough all day and night, and they can barely eat. The town doctor says they need special medicine that's far too expensive for me." As she spoke, Alistair was doing the math in his head. 4 sick children meant significant medical bills, not to mention food, clothing, and eventually, education. But on the other side of the ledger was his reputation, which depended on being seen as a generous, responsible man. Across the Badlands, Whisper was still agitated. Isabel had tried to distract him with fresh oats and cool water, but the stallion refused both. Instead, he stood by the fence that marked the edge of her property, staring intently in the direction of the town, his ears pricked to catch sounds she couldn't perceive. "You are worrying me, boy," Isabel murmured, running a hand through the horse's silky mane. "I haven't seen you like this in 3 years. 3 years. It was exactly that long ago that she had found Whisper, injured and near death, wandering the wilderness. She never found out where he came from, but from the very first day, the stallion had shown a remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. It was as if he could feel the suffering of others, even from a great distance. Back at the manor, Alistair Finch had made his decision. "Mrs. Vance, I am a businessman, but I also have a heart. These children are, in a way, my responsibility, since their father worked so faithfully for me for so many years." Eleanor's eyes lit up with cautious hope. You will help them." I will do more than that, Alistair replied, his voice adopting a solemn tone he had perfected over years of public speaking. I will take full responsibility for them. Medical treatment, food, everything they need. Eleanor sunk to her knees by the desk, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. May God bless you, Mr. Finch. You are an angel sent from heaven. Alistair rose and walked around the desk to help her up. Get up, madam, there's no need for that. His voice was kind, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. However, there are some conditions we must establish. Of course, sir. Anything you ask. First, you must understand that once I assume responsibility for these children, they will be under my complete guardianship. That means I will make all the decisions regarding their care, their education, and their future. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment. The thought of completely giving her family over to a stranger was terrifying, but the alternative was watching them waste away from their illness. I understand, sir. Second, to ensure they receive the best possible treatment, it may be necessary to take them to specialists in another city, perhaps for an extended period. You must be prepared not to see them for weeks or even months. This condition was harder to accept. Eleanor felt as if she were being asked to tear out her own heart. But the image of her nieces and nephews suffering was stronger than her fear. If it is for their own good, Mr. Finch, I accept. Alistair smiled, but there was something predatory in his expression. Excellent. In that case, I suggest you go and fetch them immediately. The sooner we can begin their treatment, the better. Eleanor stood up quickly, a new energy flowing through her veins. Yes, sir. They are in town, in the cottage we are staying in. I can bring them today. Perfect. And Mrs. Vance, it would be best if you didn't mention the specifics of our arrangement to anyone. People might not understand the generosity involved and could create unnecessary problems. Eleanor nodded vigorously. Of course, Mr. Finch. I will be discreet. After she had left, Alistair remained in his library, looking out the window at the vast, empty landscape. His plan was taking shape. He would temporarily assume responsibility for the children, preserving his reputation before the community. But as soon as the waters calmed and people forgot about the matter, he would find a permanent solution to his problem, a solution that would ensure he was never bothered by that family again. Far away, Whisper suddenly grew calm, but his intelligent eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something terrible that was yet to come. Dusk painted the sky in shades of orange as Eleanor returned to the Finch estate, driving a borrowed wagon that creaked with every turn of its wheels. In the back, 4 small figures were huddled together under faded blankets. Even from a distance, one could see the children's fragility, the pallor of their skin that contrasted with their fever-flushed cheeks. Clara, the oldest, kept a protective arm around her younger siblings. Her large, dark eyes held a premature maturity, forged by the necessity of caring for her siblings without their parents. Leo, beside her, tried to look strong, but his labored breathing betrayed the effort each movement cost him. Rosie and Sam, the youngest, slept fitfully, their small hands intertwined even in their slumber. Every so often, a dry cough would shake one of them awake, causing them to whimper softly before drifting back into a troubled rest. Alistair Finch watched their arrival from his veranda, calculating every detail of the scene. He had spent the afternoon preparing one of the guest rooms, not out of generosity, but to maintain appearances. If someone from the town happened to visit him in the coming days, they would find proof of his kindness toward the orphans. Mr. Finch, Eleanor called out as she climbed down from the wagon. I've brought my nieces and nephews, as you asked. Alistair descended the veranda steps with measured paces, his expression carefully composed into a mask of paternal concern. Of course, Mrs. Vance. Let's see how the little ones are. Clara was the first to climb out of the wagon, helping Leo to follow. They both looked at the magnificent house with a mixture of awe and shyness. They had never seen a place so grand, so different from the humble cottage where they had grown up with their parents. Don't be afraid, Eleanor whispered to them. Mr. Finch is a very good man. He's going to take care of you. Alistair approached, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hello, little ones. Welcome to my home. He crouched down to be at their level, a gesture he had learned was effective for earning trust. I hear you haven't been feeling well. Sam, the youngest, hid behind his aunt's skirt, his wide eyes watching the strange man with an instinctive mistrust. Rosie let out a dry, rattling cough that echoed in the late evening air, making Alistair's faint smile falter into a genuine frown. The children were indeed sick, more so than he had imagined. In the solitude of the Badlands, Whisper lifted his head abruptly. Something had changed in the air, a subtle disturbance that only his acute senses could detect. Isabel noticed her horse's immediate reaction. What is it this time, boy? She asked, walking toward him. You've been acting strangely all day. Whisper moved towards her and, in an uncharacteristic gesture, pressed his muzzle against her chest as if seeking comfort or trying to communicate something vital. It was a behavior she had never observed before, so human in its need for connection. Back at the manor, Alistair led the small group into the house. The contrast between the lavish, ornate interior and the children's simple, rustic clothing was stark. They walked together, their small footsteps echoing in the marble hallways. This will be your room, Alistair announced, opening the door to a spacious chamber on the second floor. I hope you'll be comfortable. Clara looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. There were two large beds with clean, white linens, more luxurious than anything she had ever seen. A large window offered a view of the manor's back garden, where a few hardy flowers still resisted the arid climate. It's wonderful, sir, she said politely, her voice weak but full of gratitude. I'm glad you like it, Alistair replied, his patience beginning to wear thin. Now, I think it would be best if you all got some rest. Tomorrow, we will begin to properly attend to your health. Eleanor kissed each of her nieces and nephews, whispering words of encouragement and promises that everything would be all right. The tears in her eyes betrayed the agony of leaving them, but the hope of seeing them healed was stronger than her fear. Be good, she whispered to Clara. Take care of each other, as you always have. After Eleanor left, Alistair remained in the hallway for a few moments, listening to the children's hushed voices through the closed door. They were speaking in low tones, Leo trying to comfort Rosie, who was crying for her aunt. Alistair went downstairs to his office, where he took out paper and ink to write a crucial letter. He needed to contact an acquaintance in a distant town, someone who could help him with the permanent solution he had devised for his problem. As he wrote, a cruel smile formed on his lips. In a week, two at most, his reputation would be secure, and he would never be bothered by that family again. Outside, in the silence of the desert night, Whisper remained awake. His ears were tuned to the distant sounds carried on the wind. Something terrible was drawing closer, he could feel it. And for the first time in his life, the noble animal experienced something akin to human fear for the fate of innocent souls he had not yet met, but whom he somehow already considered under his protection. The first week at Finchworth Manor passed like a carefully staged play. Alistair had hired a town nurse, a middle-aged woman named Nurse Daniels, known for her discretion and her financial need. Her job was to care for the children during the day, administer basic medicines, and, most importantly, to serve as a witness to her employer's generosity. The children seemed to be responding to the treatment, Nurse Daniels reported on the third day, finding Alistair in his office. Their fevers have eased a little, and they're eating better. Alistair nodded absently, his attention focused on the correspondence he had received that morning. The reply to his letter had arrived faster than expected. His contact in a town called Aguilar, a 3-day ride across the Badlands, had confirmed he could take care of the problem for a substantial sum. Mr. Finch, Nurse Daniels repeated, noticing his distraction. Yes, Nurse Daniels. Good to hear they are improving. He folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. In fact, I've received word from a specialist in childhood illnesses who can help them even more. He's in Aguilar. Nurse Daniels frowned. Aguilar? But Mr. Finch, that's a very long journey for children in such a fragile state. Sometimes the best treatments require sacrifices, Alistair replied, his voice taking on a paternal tone that concealed his true intentions. I'm sure you understand the importance of doing everything in our power for these poor children. In their room, Clara had naturally assumed the role of primary caregiver. She helped Rosie take the bitter medicine, told stories to Sam when he cried for their aunt, and shared her own portions of food with Leo when his appetite was small. When do you think we'll see Aunt Eleanor again? Rosie asked, her small voice still hoarse from coughing. Clara hesitated, remembering Alistair's words about treatments in other cities. I don't know, Rosie, but Mr. Finch said he's taking care of us, so it must be soon. Leo, though younger, had a keen intuition that made him distrust the wealthy man. I don't like him, he whispered to Clara when they were alone. The way he looks at us when he thinks we are not watching. Don't say that, Leo, Clara scolded him, though her own voice trembled slightly. He's helping us when he didn't have to. Father always said we should be grateful. Meanwhile, in the wilderness, Isabel was beginning to notice significant changes in Whisper's behavior. The stallion had all but stopped eating and drinking, and spent hours staring in the direction of the town. Their morning rides, which were usually for leisure and exploration, had become agitated and directional, as if he were searching for something specific. You're truly starting to worry me, boy, Isabel said, stroking the animal's neck. You've been like this for a week. Whisper turned to look at her, his intelligent eyes seeming to plead for understanding. For the first time, Isabel had the strange feeling that her horse was desperately trying to communicate with her about something important. At the manor, Alistair decided to accelerate his plans. The children's presence was beginning to grate on him more than he had anticipated. They made noise, asked questions, and their constant presence in his perfect house was a growing irritation. That night, he called Nurse Daniels for a private conversation. Nurse Daniels, I need you to prepare the children for a journey. A journey, sir. To Eggwiller. The specialist I mentioned has confirmed he can see them tomorrow. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Nurse Daniels looked hesitant. Mr. Finch, with all due respect, the children are still very weak. Such a long journey could be dangerous for them. Alistair looked at her coldly. I trust you are not questioning my judgment, Nurse Daniels. After all, I am the one paying for the best possible care for these children. His voice carried a subtle threat. I'm sure you wouldn't want to be responsible for preventing them from receiving the treatment they so desperately need. Nurse Daniels lowered her gaze, realizing the futility of arguing with her employer. Of course, Mr. Finch. I will have them ready. Later that night, Clara woke from a nightmare. She had dreamed she was lost in the Badlands, calling for her parents who never answered. When she opened her eyes, she saw Sam crying silently beside her. What's wrong, Sam? She whispered. I had a bad dream, he mumbled. I dreamed we were all alone, so alone, and no one was coming to find us. Clara held him tight, trying to push away her own growing fear. It was just a dream, Sam. We're safe here. But even as she said the comforting words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. There was something in Alistair Finch's eyes, something cold and calculating that reminded her of the coyotes that sometimes prowled around her family's old cottage. Outside the manor, hidden in the shadows of the night, a figure watched the illuminated second-floor window. Alistair had gone out to check on the preparations for the wagon that would be used the next day, and his slow steps betrayed the satisfaction of a man whose plan was working to perfection. In a few hours, his problem would be solved forever, and no one would ever be able to blame him for what was about to happen in the merciless heart of the Badlands. The dawn broke with a chill unusual for the region, as if the climate itself sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Nurse Daniels woke the children before the sun had fully risen. Her forced cheerfulness contrasted with the anxiety evident in her hurried movements. Come now, little ones, she said, helping Sam get dressed. Today you are going on a special trip to see a very important doctor. Clara sat on her bed, watching the preparations with a growing sense of unease. Nurse Daniels, why do we have to leave so early? And why isn't Mr. Finch here to say goodbye? Nurse Daniels avoided looking the little girl in the eye. He's busy with the travel preparations, dear. You'll see him before you leave. But it was a lie. Alistair had deliberately avoided seeing the children that morning, fearing his mask of kindness wouldn't hold up under the weight of his true intentions. Instead, he watched from a window as Nurse Daniels led them to the waiting wagon in the courtyard. Across the Badlands, Whisper was in a state of complete agitation. Isabel had never seen the animal in such turmoil. He ran from one side of his corral to the other, neighing loudly, his eyes fixed in the direction of the town. When she tried to approach to calm him, he gently but firmly nudged her away back towards the house, as if trying to protect her from some unseen danger. Whisper, what is it? Isabel asked, truly concerned now. Are you afraid? The horse looked her directly in the eye, and for a chilling moment, Isabel had the distinct feeling he was desperately trying to tell her something. His large, expressive eyes seemed to be begging for understanding, for help with something she couldn't comprehend. At the manor, the children had been helped into the wagon. Alistair had purposefully chosen an old, uncomfortable cart, claiming it was the only one available for such a long journey. The back was covered with a canvas tarp, creating a stuffy space where the 4 children settled as best they could. Leo held Rosie's hand, noticing she was trembling. It wasn't just from the morning chill. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too," Leo admitted, his own honesty surprising even himself. "But we'll be together, no matter what." Nurse Daniels climbed into the front of the wagon next to the driver, a thin, taciturn man Alistair had hired specifically for the task. She didn't know the man, but she had been instructed not to ask unnecessary questions. Finally, Alistair Finch appeared, dressed in his finest suit, maintaining a solemn expression befitting the occasion. "Children," he said, his voice full of feigned emotion. "I am sorry I cannot accompany you on this journey, but I have urgent matters to attend to here. The doctor in Eggwiller will take very good care of you." Clara looked out from the back of the wagon. "Mr. Finch, when will we be coming home?" The question caught him off guard for a second. "Soon, little one, very soon." The lie slipped easily from his lips. "Now off you go. We mustn't keep the doctor waiting." The driver flicked the reins, and the wagon began to move, its wheels creaking on the rocky ground. The children waved from the opening in the back of the canvas, and Alistair returned the gesture, holding his smile until the wagon disappeared down the dusty road. The moment it was out of sight, his smile vanished completely. He took out a pocket watch and calculated in his head. Following the instructions he had given the driver, the wagon should reach the designated spot in the Badlands in about 6 hours. There, far from any witnesses, the man would complete the second part of his instructions. Inside the wagon, the children tried to keep themselves occupied during the long, bumpy ride. Clara told stories her father used to tell, while Leo pointed out interesting rock formations they passed through the opening in the canvas. Sam and Rosie dozed off and on, their small bodies swaying with the wagon's erratic movement. "The road looks different," Leo commented after a few hours of travel. "It's not the same one we took to get here from town." Nurse Daniels, who had been silent for most of the journey, turned to check on them. She, too, had noticed they were taking a route she didn't recognize. But when she questioned the driver, he claimed to know a shortcut to Eggwiller. "Don't worry," she told the children, though her own voice betrayed a growing unease. "The driver knows these roads better than we do." But as the hours passed and the landscape became more and more desolate, even Nurse Daniels began to seriously question the journey's true destination. The vegetation had practically disappeared, replaced by arid rock and red sand that stretched to the horizon in every direction. At Isabel's homestead, Whisper had stopped eating entirely. He stood motionless by the fence, like a white marble statue against the golden landscape. His muscles were tense, his nostrils flared, as if he were breathing in something terrible on the air. Isabel decided to saddle him and try to calm him with a ride, but as soon as she approached with the saddle, Whisper did something he had never done before. He turned his back on her, refusing to be ridden, his eyes conveying a desperate urgency. It was as if he knew that somewhere, not too far away, 4 small lives were being driven inexorably toward a destination they should never have to face alone. The sun was at its highest point when the wagon finally lurched to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the dry wind that whipped sand into small eddies. The children, who had dozed off during the hottest part of the journey, began to stir at the lack of movement. "Are we there yet?" Sam asked, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Nurse Daniels climbed down from the wagon and looked around, her heart sinking as she took in their location. There was no town in sight, no houses, no people, just miles and miles of desert in every direction. Panic began to rise in her chest as she understood the full extent of what was happening. "Driver," she called out, her voice trembling. "Where are we? This can't be Aguilar." The man slowly got down from his seat, avoiding her gaze. His nervous hands fumbled with the reins as he muttered something unintelligible. It was clear he was also uncomfortable with the situation, but something was preventing him from turning back. "The children need to get out for a bit," he finally said, his voice hoarse with anxiety. "Stretch their legs, have some water. The journey's still long." Clara was the first to scramble out of the wagon, helping her younger siblings down. She immediately realized something was terribly wrong. There was no road, no town, nothing but the vast, rocky expanse of the Badlands. "Nurse Daniels," she said, turning to the woman, "where is the town? Where is the doctor?" Nurse Daniels couldn't answer. Her hands were shaking as she opened one of the canteens of water Alistair had provided for the trip. There was only enough for the afternoon, perhaps less under this scorching sun. Leo, always observant, noticed the look of growing panic on Nurse Daniel's face. "Something's wrong," he whispered to Clara. "Look how scared she is." The driver had moved a few yards away, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he returned, his face pale despite his tan. "Ma'am," he said to Nurse Daniels, "I have to go back. I have instructions." "Instructions?" Nurse Daniels repeated, her voice rising an octave. "What instructions? You can't just leave us here." The man avoided her eyes and walked back to the wagon. "You have to wait here. Someone will come for you." "Who will come?" Nurse Daniels shouted, running after him. "When? We can't stay here with 4 sick children." But the driver was already climbing back into the wagon with one last, regretful glance. He flicked the reins, and the vehicle began to move, kicking up a cloud of dust that soon dissipated into the dry air. The children watched in stunned silence as their only connection to civilization vanished over the horizon. The sound of the hooves and the wagon's wheels faded slowly until all that was left was the ceaseless desert wind. "Nurse Daniels," Rosie said, her small voice fragile. "When is he coming back? When is God coming to save us?" Nurse Daniels couldn't respond. She looked at the 4 small faces staring up at her with absolute trust, expecting that she, the only adult present, would know what to do. But the terrible truth was dawning on her. They had been abandoned to die. Far from there, on the homestead, Whisper suddenly reared up as if struck by lightning. A tremor ran through his entire body, and he began to run in circles, his whinnies echoing across the property like a primal lament. Isabel came running out of the house at the sound. "Whisper, what is it?" The horse ran towards her, pressed his muzzle against her shoulder for a moment, and then bolted towards the gate that opened onto the vast Badlands. He stopped there, looking back, as if waiting for her to follow. "You want me to go with you?" Isabel asked, her intuition finally beginning to catch up with the animal's urgency. "There's something out there, isn't there?" Whisper let out a low, mournful sound she had never heard before. It was almost as if he were crying. Back in the desert, the children were huddled in the small patch of shade offered by a single large rock. Nurse Daniels carefully rationed the water, giving each child a tiny sip, knowing she had to make it last as long as possible. "Let's play a game," Clara said, trying to distract the younger ones. "Let's tell stories from when we were with Aunt Eleanor." Sam snuggled up beside her. "Tell the one about when Father took us fishing in the creek." As Clara told the family stories, trying to keep her voice cheerful, Leo scanned the horizon in every direction. He had understood, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, that no one was coming for them. They were utterly alone in the merciless heart of the Badlands, with enough water for only a few more hours and no real shelter from a sun that grew more punishing with each passing minute. Nurse Daniels closed her eyes, her tears evaporating before they could even roll down her face. She had been deceived, used as a pawn in a monstrous plan. And now, 4 innocent children would pay the price for her naivety. On the distant horizon, a small white speck began to move towards them, but it was still too far away to be seen or heard. Whisper had finally convinced Isabel to follow him, and now they were riding desperately against time, guided only by the noble animal's supernatural instinct. The hours passed like an eternity under the relentless sun. Nurse Daniels had fainted a while ago, overcome by a combination of dehydration and despair. The children huddled around her, Leo trying to shield Rosie, and Sam with his own small shadow, while Clara moistened the nurse's lips with the last few drops of water that remained. "Clara," Rosie whispered, her voice barely audible, "I'm so hot." The older girl looked at her little sister, seeing how her cheeks were flushed crimson and her lips were cracked. Sam had stopped crying a long time ago, simply because he had no tears left. Leo kept his eyes closed to conserve energy, but his breathing was becoming more and more labored. "Let's try to sleep for a little while," Clara murmured, though she knew it was dangerous to fall asleep in this heat. "When we wake up, someone will have come for us." She no longer believed the words herself, but she needed to keep hope alive for the little ones. In her mind, she began to pray the prayers her mother had taught her, begging for a miracle that seemed impossible in this lifeless expanse. It was then that she heard a faint, distant sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it was rhythmic, constant, like hooves against the earth. She opened her eyes, trying to focus through the heat haze that distorted the horizon. "Leo," she whispered, touching her brother's shoulder. "Do you hear that?" Leo lifted his head with an effort, his ears straining. The sound was growing clearer, closer. It was definitely hooves, but of a single horse, not a wagon. On the horizon, a shape began to form. At first, it was just a dark speck against the pale blue sky, but then it gradually resolved into 2 figures, a horse as white as snow and a woman with dark hair. Whisper had found them. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she finally spotted the small figures huddled near the rocks. Even from a distance, she could see they were in critical condition. Whisper was neighing softly now, a sound of relief mixed with urgency. "Good boy," she murmured, patting the horse's sweat-drenched neck. "You found them." As they drew closer, Isabel could see the full extent of the tragedy. 4 children and an adult woman, all clearly dehydrated and exhausted, abandoned in the middle of nowhere without adequate water or shelter. Her rage at whoever was responsible was immediate and profound. "Hello," she called out, dismounting quickly. "You are safe now." Clara lifted her head with an effort, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. A real woman with a real horse, not a mirage created by heat and desperation. "Please," she whispered, "help us." Isabel immediately took out her canteen and ran towards the children. "Slowly now," she said, helping Clara take a small sip. "Very slowly, or you'll get sick." She gave water to each child, and then to Nurse Daniels, who was beginning to regain consciousness. The relief on the small faces as they tasted the fresh water was heart-wrenching. "How did you get here?" Isabel asked, as she created more shade with her own coat. "A man, Mr. Finch," Clara managed to say between careful sips of water. "He said we were going to see a doctor, but the driver he just left us here." Isabel felt her blood boil. She knew of Alistair Finch by reputation a wealthy and influential man, but she had always suspected there was something dark behind his respectable facade. Now she had proof. "You were very brave," she said, gently stroking Rosie's hair. "But you are safe now. My name is Isabel, and this is Whisper. He found you." Whisper approached the children, lowering his head so they could touch him. Sam, despite his weakness, reached out a small hand to stroke the horse's soft muzzle. "He's beautiful," Sam whispered. "He's special," Isabel agreed. "He senses when people need help, even when they are very far away." Nurse Daniels had recovered enough consciousness to speak. "I didn't know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He told me it was for a doctor." "I never imagined. It's not your fault," Isabel reassured her, though her own voice was tight with suppressed anger. "You were deceived too." Isabel quickly assessed the situation. The children were too weak for a long, immediate journey. They needed rest, more water, and food. Her homestead was a 2-hour ride away, but it would be impossible to take them all at once on Whisper. "I'll leave you with more water and some food," she decided. "My home isn't far. I'll go get my wagon and be back before sunset." "No," Clara said, grabbing Isabel's sleeve with surprising strength. "Please don't leave us." The fear in the girl's eyes was gut-wrenching. Isabel understood that these children had just lived through the trauma of being abandoned by an adult they had trusted. The idea of being left alone again, even temporarily, was terrifying for them. "All right," Isabel decided. "Whisper is strong. We'll all go together, slowly." "Can you walk a little?" she asked Clara. The girl nodded with determination. "I can do it. For my brothers and sister." Isabel helped mount a stunned Nurse Daniels onto Whisper. Then she lifted Sam and placed him in front of her. She put Rosie behind her, holding on tightly to Isabel's waist. Clara and Leo walked alongside, each with a hand on a stirrup for support. And so, the journey to life began, with Whisper carrying not just the weight of his passengers, but the weight of their very lives, moving like a four-legged angel, carrying hope across the desert towards a new beginning. Isabel's homestead appeared on the horizon like an oasis of hope after hours of slow trekking through the Badlands. It was a simple but sturdy structure, with adobe walls that promised coolness after the constant heat. A well with a hand pump stood in the yard, and a few chickens pecked freely near a small stable. "We are here," Isabel announced softly, feeling Sam relax in her arms. The little boy had fallen asleep during the second half of the journey, exhausted by the ordeal. Rosie was dozing too, leaning against Isabel's back, while Clara and Leo had walked with an impressive determination, refusing to give up. Whisper stopped near the porch, his flanks lathered in sweat, but his head still held high. He had carried a burden far heavier than the physical weight of the children. He had carried their hopes, their fears, their precious lives through the harsh desert. Isabel dismounted carefully, first handing Sam to Leo and then helping Rosie down. The children looked around with a mixture of relief and shyness. After the oppressive luxury of Finchworth Manor and the terror of being abandoned in the desert, this simple home seemed to represent something they had lost long ago, a real home. "Come on," Isabel said, leading them inside. "You need to be cleaned up, fed, and rested." The interior of the house was cozy and functional. Dark wood furniture, simple but clean fabrics, and a smell of wood smoke and spices spoke of meals made with love. A large fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by comfortable chairs that seemed to invite long conversations and companionable silence. Nurse Daniels, who had remained quiet for the entire journey, finally found her voice. "Mrs. Croft, I don't know how to thank you." "If you hadn't appeared, there's nothing to thank me for," Isabel interrupted kindly. "Any decent person would have done the same." She paused, looking at the 4 children who were still huddled together in a state of shock. "But now we must take care of what's important. Nurse Daniels, do you feel well enough to help me bathe them?" The following hours passed in a flurry of gentle, loving activity. Isabel heated water on the wood stove and filled a large tub in the kitchen. One by one, the children were gently bathed, their dirty, sweat-stained clothes replaced with clean shirts that Isabel had made for herself, which served as comfortable nightgowns for the little ones. While bathing Sam, the most traumatized of all, Isabel noticed that he flinched every time an adult moved too quickly. "Hey, little one," she said gently, crouching down to his level. "No one is ever going to hurt you here again. You are safe." Sam looked at her with his big, dark eyes, still full of fear, but also with a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. "Promise?" "I promise," Isabel replied, feeling her heart break a little. "And Whisper promises too. You see how he's watching over you?" Meanwhile, in the town, Alistair Finch was in his office, calculating the timing of his operation. By his estimates, the children should be gone by now. The driver was due to return by nightfall with confirmation that the task was complete. He had his story prepared for when Eleanor inevitably showed up asking about her nieces and nephews. A terrible tragedy on the way to Aguilar, perhaps a wagon accident or bandits. He would appear devastated, offer generous condolences, and his reputation would remain intact. Back at the homestead, Isabel had prepared a simple but nourishing chicken broth with vegetables from her small garden. The children ate slowly, their stomachs still sensitive after their ordeal, but each spoonful seemed to bring a little life back to their pale faces. "This soup is delicious," Clara said politely, her good manners holding up even after everything that had happened. "My mother taught me the recipe," Isabel replied, feeling a pang of sorrow for their lost family. She used to say that food made with love heals both the body and the soul. Leo, who had remained observant and cautious, finally asked the question they were all thinking. "Mrs. Croft, what's going to happen to us now?" It was a complicated question that Isabel had been avoiding considering in its entirety. Legally, the children were still in the custody of Alistair Finch. She couldn't just keep them without facing legal consequences, but she couldn't possibly allow them to return to the man who had tried to kill them. For now, you are going to stay here, she said carefully. You will rest, you will recover, and together, we will figure out the best way forward. Nurse Daniels leaned forward. I can testify to what happened. To how we were deceived, to the abandonment in the desert. That has to mean something, legally. It will mean something, Isabel nodded, her voice hardening. Alistair Finch will pay for what he did. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in makeshift beds in the main room, refusing to be separated even for sleep, Isabel went out to tend to Whisper. The horse was in his pasture, grazing peacefully in the moonlight, but his alert eyes showed he was still on guard. You did something special today, you know that, she murmured, stroking his neck. How did you know? How did you feel they needed help? Whisper pressed his muzzle into her palm, and Isabel had that strange feeling again that the animal understood more than was thought possible. There was something special about him, something that transcended the normal intelligence of a horse. As she looked at the house, where 4 children were finally sleeping safely after days of terror, Isabel made a silent decision. No matter the cost, no matter who she had to fight, she would protect those children. And Whisper, as if listening to her thoughts, neighed softly in a sign of agreement. Dawn brought a sense of peace the children hadn't experienced in weeks. Sam was the first to wake up, confused for a moment not to find the elegant walls of Finchworth Manor, but then quickly remembering the events of the previous day. The relief in his small eyes was immediate and profound. Isabel had been awake for hours, preparing breakfast and planning her next steps. She knew she couldn't keep the children hidden forever. At some point, she would have to face the legal system and Alistair Finch, but first, they needed to fully recover, and she needed solid proof. Good morning, little one, she said softly as Sam appeared in the kitchen, still wearing the large shirt that served as his pajamas. Did you sleep well? Sam nodded but approached hesitantly. Mrs. Croft? You are not going to take us somewhere else, are you? The simple, direct question touched Isabel's heart in a way she hadn't expected. No, Sam. You are safe here. One by one, the others woke up. Rosie immediately sought out Clara, who calmed her with a hug. Leo observed everything with his watchful eyes, always on the lookout for signs of danger. Nurse Daniels woke up last, still recovering from the trauma of the previous day. During a simple but nourishing breakfast, Nurse Daniels finally told the whole truth about how she had been deceived. I should have known better, she said, her hands trembling slightly. When he insisted so much on the trip, when he wouldn't give me details about the doctor, you trusted someone who was supposed to be trustworthy, Isabel comforted her. The fault is not yours, Nurse Daniels. Clara looked up from her bowl of porridge. Mrs. Croft, what are you going to do when Mr. Finch finds out we are not gone? It was a profound question for an 8-year-old girl, and it showed that Clara was beginning to understand the extent of the betrayal they had suffered. Isabel chose her words carefully. He will probably invent more lies, she said honestly. But now we have witnesses to the truth. And the truth always wins in the end. Meanwhile, in the town, Alistair Finch was growing impatient. The driver should have returned the night before, but there was no sign of him. Alistair paced by his office window, looking out at the main street with growing anxiety. His concern intensified when he saw Eleanor Vance walking determinedly towards his house. The woman looked more resolute than desperate this time, and that worried him. The bell rang, and Alistair answered it personally, forcing his most solemn expression. "Mrs. Vance, what a surprise to see you so soon." "Mr. Finch," Eleanor said, her voice firmer than he remembered. "I've come to ask about my nieces and nephews. How long will they have to be with the doctor in Aguilar?" Alistair hesitated. His original plan had been to wait for confirmation of the tragedy before speaking to Eleanor, but now, with no news from the driver, he had to improvise. "There have been complications," he said slowly. The journey was difficult. Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. What kind of complications? Back at the homestead, Isabel decided it was time to act. She couldn't remain passive while Alistair was free to invent more lies. "Nurse Daniels," she said, "do you feel strong enough to ride to town with me? To tell the sheriff what really happened? To expose Alistair Finch for who he truly is?" Nurse Daniels nodded with determination. "Yes, I'm ready." The children were visibly nervous at the idea of Isabel leaving. "Will you come back?" Leo asked, his voice full of anxiety. "We will be back before dusk," Isabel promised. "And Whisper will stay here with you. If anyone comes who shouldn't, he will know." As if understanding her words, Whisper positioned himself near the porch of the house, assuming a protective stance. His ears were alert, and his eyes scanned the horizon. The journey to town took 2 hours. Isabel had lent an older mare to Nurse Daniels, and they rode in silence for most of the way, each lost in her own thoughts about the confrontation to come. The sheriff's office was in the center of town, a small building, but one that represented the law in that remote region. Sheriff Brody was a middle-aged man, known for his honesty but also for his tendency to avoid conflicts with influential people like Alistair Finch. "Isabel," he said, surprised to see her. "It's been a long time since you came to town. What brings you here?" "A very serious matter, Sheriff Brody. This is Nurse Daniels. She has something important to report." Nurse Daniels took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She described how she was hired to care for the children, how she was deceived about the destination of the trip, and how they were abandoned in the desert to die. The sheriff listened, his expression growing more and more grave. "These are very serious accusations, Nurse Daniels. Are you sure there wasn't some misunderstanding?" "A misunderstanding, Sheriff?" Isabel interrupted, her voice full of suppressed outrage. "I found those children in the desert, dehydrated and on the verge of death. There is no misunderstanding that explains that." At that exact moment, the office door opened, and Alistair Finch entered, dressed in his best suit and carrying his authority like a shield. "Sheriff Brody, I've come to report that someone is spreading malicious rumors about me in town." The confrontation Isabel had both feared and hoped for had finally arrived. Alistair looked at her and Nurse Daniels with a thinly veiled contempt, ready to use all his influence to discredit their accusations. "Ah, Mr. Finch," the sheriff said, clearly uncomfortable. "I was just listening to a story about the children." Alistair adopted his most impressive posture. "Sheriff, these women are clearly disturbed by a terrible tragedy. The children I so generously took into my care, they vanished during their trip to receive medical treatment. It is a great loss for me as well. The silence that followed was tense and heavy with emotion. Isabel realized that this was the critical moment. Everything depended on how she and Nurse Daniels could present the truth against the sophisticated lies of a powerful man. The air in the sheriff's office was thick with the impending confrontation. Alistair Finch maintained his arrogant posture, confident in his ability to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Sheriff Brody looked distinctly uncomfortable, caught between his duty to investigate the accusations and his fear of confronting the most powerful man in the region. As I was explaining to the sheriff, Alistair began, in his most persuasive voice, "I am deeply saddened that these women have been deceived by an impostor pretending to work for me. I am sure they are the victims of an elaborate scam." Isabel felt her anger boil in her veins. "A scam? Mr. Finch, Nurse Daniels worked in your manor for a whole week. She saw you personally give the travel instructions." "Impossible," Alistair replied smoothly. "I have never hired this woman. I have never seen her before in my life." Nurse Daniels took a step forward, her hands trembling with indignation. "How dare you lie like that? I cared for the children in your own house. I know every detail of that place." Alistair looked at her with calculated disdain. "Madam, I understand you may be confused after a traumatic experience, but I can prove you were never on my property. My staff can testify that no new nurse was hired." Sheriff Brody stroked his beard, clearly conflicted. The word of Alistair Finch against two women with no political influence was an unequal battle in a society where power spoke louder than justice. "Where are the children now?" the sheriff asked, trying to find some common ground. "Safe at my homestead," Isabel answered firmly, recovering from near death. "Sheriff," Alistair interrupted, his voice taking on a wounded, authoritative tone. "Those children are my legal responsibility. If this woman is holding them against my will, that constitutes kidnapping." The accusation landed like a thunderbolt in the room. Isabel felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Alistair was using her own compassion against her, turning a rescue into a crime. "Kidnapping," she repeated in disbelief. "I saved their lives." "That is your version of events," Alistair said coldly. "But I have a different version. The children disappeared during a legitimate medical trip, and now I find out they are being held by a stranger on an isolated homestead." Sheriff Brody sighed. "Isabel, I am going to need you to bring the children to town. We need to clarify this situation properly." "No," Isabel burst out. "They have just barely recovered from their trauma. I cannot subject them to more stress." At that moment, the office door opened again, and Eleanor Vance rushed in, her clothes showing she had ridden quickly to town. "Sheriff Brody," she panted, "I need to know what has happened to my nieces and nephews. Mr. Finch told me there were complications, but he wouldn't give me details." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Alistair Finch, who, for the first time since the conversation began, seemed genuinely affected. Eleanor was a witness he had not anticipated. "Mrs. Vance," he began cautiously, "as I was explaining to the sheriff, there was a terrible tragedy on the way to Eggwiller." "What tragedy?" Eleanor demanded, her face pale. Isabel saw her opportunity. "Mrs. Vance, your nieces and nephews are alive and well. They are at my homestead, recovering from being abandoned in the desert to die. Eleanor looked from Isabel to Alistair, confusion and hope warring in her eyes. They're alive? She is lying to you, madam, Alistair said quickly. The children disappeared on the journey. They were likely abducted by bandits. Eleanor approached Isabel and studied her face intensely. You've seen them. You've really seen them. I have seen them, I have cared for them, I have given them water and food, Isabel replied with absolute sincerity. Clara specifically asked me to tell you that they are okay. The name of her eldest niece made Eleanor sway slightly. No one outside the family knew that Clara always asked to send specific messages to her aunt. How is she? Eleanor whispered. Brave, Isabel answered, her voice softening, caring for her siblings even when she was terrified. She has the same strong spirit as you. Alistair realized he was losing control of the situation. Sheriff, this is clearly an elaborate setup. I demand that these women be arrested for kidnapping and extortion. Extortion? Sheriff Brody repeated, confused. It's obvious. They want money in exchange for the children. It's an old trick, pretend to rescue some children and then demand a reward. Isabel felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The cruelty and coldness of Alistair Finch, turning every act of kindness into a crime, was breathtaking. Eleanor, however, had made her decision. Sheriff Brody, I want to see my nieces and nephews. Now. And if this woman says they are safe with her, then that is where I want to go. Mrs. Vance, you are being manipulated by these criminals, Alistair tried to intervene. Eleanor turned to him with a firmness that surprised everyone. You told me my nieces and nephews were gone. This woman tells me they are alive. I am going to find out who is telling the truth. Sheriff Brody finally made a decision. We will all go to Isabel's homestead. I will see the children with my own eyes, and I will listen to what they have to say. Then we will be able to determine the truth. Alistair tried to protest but was overruled by the determination of the others. As he prepared to ride to the homestead, he quickly calculated his options. His plan had failed spectacularly, but he still had enough influence to shape the narrative in his favor. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, on the distant homestead, Whisper had lifted his head suddenly, his nostrils catching something familiar on the wind. His eyes turned towards the town, and he neighed softly, as if calling someone home. The ride to the homestead was tense and silent. Each member of the group was lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor rode beside Isabel, her hands trembling with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Sheriff Brody maintained a neutral expression, but his eyes revealed his concern for the complicated situation about to unfold. Alistair rode behind, his mind working furiously to find a way out of the pit he had dug for himself. As they approached the homestead, Whisper appeared at the fence, neighing as if to announce the visitors' arrival. The children, who were playing in the yard under the shade of a large mesquite tree, looked up at the familiar sound. Aunt Eleanor! Sam cried out. He was the first to recognize the familiar figure and ran towards the fence, followed by the other three, their voices mingling in cries of joy and relief. Eleanor dismounted before the horse had even come to a complete stop, her tears flowing freely as she desperately hugged each of her nieces and nephews. My children, she whispered, my treasures. I thought I would never see you again." Alistair watched the scene with growing unease. The genuine joy of the children at seeing their aunt was undeniable, as was their healthy and well cared for appearance. His kidnapping story was collapsing before his eyes. Auntie Clara said, taking Eleanor's hand. "Mr. Finch took us far away and left us in the desert. But Isabel and Whisper saved us." "Children," Alistair interrupted quickly, forcing a paternal smile. "How good to see you are all well. I was so worried when the driver, he didn't disappear." "You sent the driver to leave us there," Leo said, looking at Alistair with an expression that mixed confusion and rage. "Leo," Alistair said in a condescending tone. "You are too young to understand what really happened. Sometimes children invent stories when they are scared." The condescension in Alistair's voice awakened something fierce in Clara. Although she was only 8 years old, she possessed a lucidity and determination that impressed everyone present. "I am not inventing a story," she said, her voice small but firm. "I remember everything. You said we were going to see a doctor, but the driver took us to the desert and left us there. He said someone would come for us, but no one came. We were so hot and thirsty, and Nurse Daniels fainted." Sheriff Brody knelt down to be at the children's level. "Clara, are you sure about what you are saying? It's very important that you only tell the truth." "I am telling the truth," she insisted, her eyes filling with frustrated tears. "Why don't adults believe us? We know what happened to us." Rosie approached her sister, seeking protection. "The man in the wagon left us and went away. All alone," she said in her faint voice. "I was so scared." Sam, the youngest, ran to Eleanor and hid in her skirts. "Auntie, I don't want to go back to that man's house. Mr. Finch doesn't like us." The sincerity and fear in the children's voices were undeniable. Eleanor looked at Alistair with an expression of both hurt and fury. "How could you do this to innocent children?" "Mrs. Vance," Alistair tried to maintain his composure. "These children have suffered a trauma and are confused. They need proper medical attention, not to be held on an isolated homestead by a stranger." Isabel took a step forward, her patience finally exhausted. "Sheriff Brody, I want to show you something." She led the group into the house, where she had kept the clothes the children were wearing when she found them. The clothes were stiff with sand, stained with sweat and tears, physical proof of the ordeal they had faced. "These were their clothes when I found them," Isabel explained. "Look at the sand, the state of dehydration. These children were in the desert for hours, maybe even a whole day." Nurse Daniels, who had remained silent, finally found the courage to speak again. "Sheriff, I can describe every detail of the Finchworth estate, the office with the bookshelves, the room where the children stayed, the kitchen where I prepared their meals. How could I know those things if I had never been there?" Alistair realized he was cornered, his lies contradicting each other and the evidence piling up against him. In desperation, he tried one last move. "Sheriff," he said, his voice laced with wounded authority. "I don't know what game these women are playing, but the children are my legal responsibility. I demand they be returned to my custody immediately." It was then that Leo, with his sharp intuition, asked the question that changed everything. "If you cared so much about us," he said, looking directly at Alistair, "why were you smiling when the wagon drove away? I saw you." I was looking through the window. You were smiling when you thought no one was watching. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The innocent observation of a child had revealed the most devastating truth of all. Not only had Alistair planned the abandonment, but he had felt satisfaction in doing it. Alistair tried to deny it, but his expression betrayed him. The sheriff looked at the man he had known for years, seeing him in a completely new and disturbing light. Mr. Finch, Sheriff Brody said slowly, I think you and I have a lot to talk about. And this time, it will be in my office under official custody. The children gathered around Eleanor and Isabel, finally feeling that their words were being taken seriously. Whisper approached the group, as if offering his own silent protection to the small souls he had helped save. The truth had finally prevailed, but the road to justice was just beginning.